Native Americans built the most advanced housing in North America, then mysteriously walked away from their architectural masterpieces forever. What could possibly force an entire civilization to abandon perfection itself? The Iroquois knew how to live well. We're talking about Native Americans who built structures that would make modern architects weep with envy. Their longhouses weren't just homes, they were architectural masterpieces stretching over 200 feet long. That's longer than half a football field, folks. But here's what blows my mind. These weren't cramped bachelor pads. A single longhouse could comfortably house 60 people from the same clan. Think your family reunions are crowded? Try sharing cooking fires with your great-aunt's entire extended family for months at a time. The regions where these longhouses sprouted up were basically nature's grocery stores. Deer practically walked up to the front door. Wild berries grew so thick you'd trip over them. Rivers teemed with fish that seemed eager to jump into cooking pots. The soil was so rich it could grow crops that would feed entire communities without breaking a sweat. Makes sense, right? When you've got everything you need within walking distance, why would you ever leave? These longhouses became symbols of prosperity. Owning one was like driving a Cadillac in 1955. It announced to the world that you'd made it. The bigger your longhouse, the more important your clan. Some of these structures were so impressive that European visitors wrote home about them in amazement. Well, here's where it gets interesting. The Iroquois Confederacy didn't just build these things for show, they were designed for multi-generational living that actually worked. Grandparents, parents, kids, and cousins all had their designated spaces. Everyone had a role, everyone contributed, and somehow they avoided the kind of family drama that sends modern relatives running for the hills after 3 days together. The abundance surrounding these communities created something remarkable: stability. For generations, families returned to the same longhouses, added onto them, improved them, and passed them down like precious heirlooms. These structures became the foundation of cultural identity, the center of spiritual life, and the hub of political power. But here's the weird part. Despite having what seemed like the perfect setup, spacious homes, abundant resources, and strong community bonds, these Native Americans eventually walked away from their longhouses. They abandoned these architectural marvels that represented generations of craftsmanship and cultural significance. What could possibly convince people to leave paradise? Well, Mother Nature had some opinions about that arrangement. Winter hits differently when your house is made of bark and animal hides. Makes sense, right? The Iroquois and other longhouse dwellers weren't about to freeze their way through a brutal northeast winter just to prove a point about permanent housing. These folks were smarter than we give them credit for. When temperatures dropped and snow piled up to your waist, many families would pack up and head south. Kind of like today's retirees fleeing to Florida, except with a lot more survival skills and fewer golf carts. But here's the thing that'll surprise you. They weren't abandoning their longhouses forever. Think of it more like closing up the summer cottage. These massive structures served as home base, but survival meant being flexible enough to chase better weather when Mother Nature got cranky. The seasonal migrations weren't random wandering either. Native American communities had this down to a science that would make modern meteorologists jealous. They knew exactly when to move, where to go, and most importantly, when to come back. Some tribes would spend harsh winter months in sheltered valleys or warmer regions, then return to their longhouses come spring like clockwork. Well, here's where it gets interesting. Following the seasons often meant following the food. Migrating animals didn't consult the longhouse rental agreements before heading south for winter. Deer, elk, and other game moved with the weather patterns, and smart hunters moved with them. Historical records show entire communities operating on this seasonal rhythm for generations. They'd maintain their longhouses during the good months, then shift to temporary shelters during harsh weather or lean times. It was like having a primary residence and a winter retreat, except the stakes were actual survival instead of just avoiding snow removal duties. And the weird part is, this flexibility became their strength. While European settlers often struggled through brutal winters and fixed locations, Native Americans had perfected the art of seasonal adaptation. They understood something we're just rediscovering. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is know when to leave. The longhouses would sit there, waiting, weathering storms, collecting snow, but ready for their family's return. These weren't signs of failure or abandonment. They were proof of intelligent planning. Then, there's the matter of what happened when the game itself started disappearing from traditional hunting grounds entirely. Here's where things get really interesting. You know how your neighbor Bob always brags about his perfectly manicured lawn, then suddenly it's full of brown patches? Well, Native American communities faced something way more serious than dead grass. The deer started disappearing first. These weren't just random animals wandering around. They were basically the grocery store, clothing outlet, and hardware store all rolled into one furry package. Makes sense, right? One deer could feed a family for weeks, provide leather for clothing, and bones for tools. But here's the kicker. When you've got 50 people living in a 200-foot longhouse, you need a lot of deer. And the weird part is, it wasn't just bad luck. These communities were actually too good at hunting. They'd clear out the local deer population faster than a Black Friday sale empties the electronics aisle. The Iroquois were so efficient with their hunting techniques that they'd literally hunt themselves out of a home. Then there were the beaver. Oh boy, the beaver situation was like watching your retirement fund disappear during a stock market crash. These little dam builders were pure gold. Their pelts were warm, waterproof, and perfect for trade. But beavers reproduce about as fast as a government committee makes decisions. Slow. Really slow. Let's not forget the smaller game either. Rabbits, birds, even fish populations would drop when a large longhouse community settled nearby. It's like having a massive family reunion that never ends. Eventually, someone's going to eat all the food in the refrigerator. The archaeological evidence tells us something fascinating. Researchers have found layers of animal bones around old longhouse sites that show a clear pattern. Lots of bones at the bottom, fewer in the middle, almost none at the top. Translation: the party was over, and it was time to find a new neighborhood. But here's what really gets interesting about this whole situation. These weren't desperate people making panicked decisions. They were strategic planners who understood their environment better than most modern folks understand their own backyards. When the local wildlife started thinning out, they had backup plans. The question becomes, where exactly did they plan to go? Because following random animal trails through the wilderness sounds about as appealing as using a flip phone in 2024. But some animals were worth following no matter how far they wandered. The buffalo. Now, there's a creature that changed everything for Native Americans living in longhouses. These massive animals, some weighing over 2,000 pounds, weren't just wandering around aimlessly like your neighbor's dog. They moved with purpose, following ancient migration routes that stretched across thousands of miles. Picture this. You've built yourself a beautiful 200-foot longhouse, complete with all the amenities a 16th century family could want. Then someone runs in shouting that 10,000 buffalo are heading south for winter. What do? Pack up and follow the grocery store. Of course, the Plains tribes figured this out faster than a teenager learns to text. Those magnificent longhouses, too heavy, too permanent, too much like trying to move a Victorian mansion on wheels. The buffalo didn't care about your beautiful bark construction or your carefully planned communal spaces. Makes sense, right? These herds were essentially walking supermarkets, providing meat, hides, bones for tools, and sinew for thread. Everything a family needed was literally on the hoof, moving at about 3 miles per hour across the Great Plains. But here's where it gets interesting. The Iroquois and other woodland tribes had perfected longhouse living over centuries. They'd developed sophisticated social structures, political systems, even early forms of democracy, all centered around these permanent structures. Abandoning that wasn't like switching from a sedan to an SUV. It was like giving up your entire lifestyle. The smart tribes developed what we might call a dual housing strategy today. Keep some longhouses as home base, but create mobile units that could follow the herds. Enter the teepee. Lightweight, weatherproof, and designed by people who understood that sometimes dinner walks away from you. Archaeological evidence shows this transition wasn't sudden. Some communities spent decades perfecting portable shelters while maintaining their longhouse traditions. They were basically inventing the RV lifestyle 500 years before Winnebago figured it out. The buffalo herds were so massive they could take days to pass a single point. Imagine trying to explain to your great-grandmother why you're abandoning the family longhouse to follow a moving carpet of shaggy beef across the prairie. But Grandma, the stakes are walking south. This shift created some of history's most efficient nomadic societies, but following buffalo herds brought its own challenges. challenges that went far beyond just packing light. You know what nobody tells you about the perfect longhouse location? The ground beneath your feet could betray you faster than a fair-weather friend at a poker game. Native Americans weren't just randomly picking spots to build these massive structures. They were like ancient real estate agents, except instead of checking school districts, they were testing soil fertility. And boy, did Mother Nature have some cruel jokes waiting for them. Here's the thing about soil. It's basically the stomach of the earth. Feed it right, and it'll keep your corn, beans, and squash growing like nobody's business. Treat it poorly, and it'll give you the agricultural equivalent of indigestion. After 3 or 4 growing seasons in the same spot, even the richest soil would start throwing tantrums. The Haudenosaunee people knew this better than most modern farmers. They'd plant their 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, in carefully planned gardens around their longhouses. Sounds perfect, right? Well, here's where it gets interesting. Those crops were hungry little things, sucking nutrients from the soil like teenagers raiding a refrigerator. Native farmers were actually ahead of their time, understanding crop rotation principles that Europeans wouldn't figure out for centuries. But even with their sophisticated knowledge, there came a point where the soil would wave its white flag. The corn stalks would grow shorter, bean pods would get scrawnier, squash would look sadder than a deflated balloon at a birthday party. When this happened, families faced a choice that would make modern homeowners weep. Pack up and find better ground, or watch their children go hungry. Not exactly rocket science, is it? But here's what makes this really fascinating. They weren't just abandoning these longhouses forever. Think of it like having a vacation home that you rotate between. They'd move to fresh ground, let the old soil recover for several years, then potentially return when the earth had recharged its batteries. Some archaeological sites show evidence of longhouses being rebuilt in the same locations decades later. That's pretty smart resource management, if you ask me. Better than our modern habit of just dumping fertilizer on tired soil until it screams for mercy. The whole process was like being in a long-term relationship with the land itself. Sometimes you needed space to grow. Sometimes the ground needed time to heal. However, soil wasn't the only thing causing headaches for these communities. The political landscape was about to get a whole lot messier. Politics among Native American tribes was messier than a family dinner during election season. And just like how your crazy uncle's political rants can drive you to eat Thanksgiving dinner in the garage, shifting tribal alliances often forced entire communities to pack up their longhouses and relocate. The Iroquois Confederacy understood this better than anyone. These weren't just random moves. They were calculated chess pieces in a game where your home could become tomorrow's battleground. When tribal relationships soured, staying put in your beautiful 200-foot longhouse was like keeping your money in a bank that's about to get robbed. But here's where it gets interesting. Warfare wasn't always about conquest. Sometimes it was about sending messages. A well-positioned longhouse could serve as a diplomatic statement, basically saying, we're strong enough to live here permanently. Other times, abandoning one showed flexibility and avoided unnecessary conflict. The weird part is how these political decisions rippled through entire communities. When the Mohawks had beef with neighboring tribes, it wasn't just the warriors who felt it. Families, elders, children, everyone had to consider whether their cozy longhouse was worth defending or if it was smarter to relocate to friendlier territory. Think about the logistics here. Moving wasn't like loading up a U-Haul. These communities had to coordinate massive relocations, sometimes involving hundreds of people. The longhouse that took months to build could be abandoned in days when political wind shifted. Then there's the fascinating aspect of seasonal politics. Some tribes maintain multiple longhouses in different regions, using them strategically based on current alliances. It was like having vacation homes, except your choice of which one to use depended on who wanted to scalp you that particular season. What really gets overlooked is how these political moves often coincided with resource management. Smart leaders knew that overstaying in one location could strain both natural resources and diplomatic relationships. Moving became a way to reset both ecological and political pressures. The Haudenosaunee perfected this balance, treating their longhouses as anchors in a fluid political landscape. They could abandon settlements when tensions rose, then return when conditions improved. It was political flexibility at its finest. Political instability wasn't the only factor driving these relocations, though. The economic opportunities created by extensive trade networks were equally compelling, pulling communities toward new possibilities that their stationary longhouses simply couldn't accommodate. The fur trade changed everything. When European traders arrived with their metal pots, colorful beads, and sharp knives, Native Americans suddenly had access to goods that made their traditional tools look like something from the Stone Age. Well, technically they were from the Stone Age, but you get the point. These weren't just pretty trinkets either. We're talking about revolutionary technology. A metal axe could fell a tree 10 times faster than a stone one. Glass beads lasted longer than shells and looked better too. Iron cookware? That was like upgrading from a horse and buggy to a Ferrari. But here's where things got interesting. The best furs came from animals living hundreds of miles away from longhouse settlements. Beaver pelts were worth their weight in gold, literally. One prime beaver pelt could buy a dozen metal knives or enough cloth to outfit an entire family. Think about it like this. If someone told you there was oil in Alaska, you wouldn't expect to strike it rich sitting in your Miami beach house, right? Native American traders became incredibly mobile. They'd travel for months, following trap lines and hunting grounds that stretched across vast territories. Longhouses became about as practical as hauling a piano to a camping trip. You needed shelter that could move with you, pack up quickly, and wouldn't make you cry if you had to abandon it. The trade routes themselves were like early highways. Strategic locations along rivers and mountain passes became temporary settlements. Some spots were perfect for summer trading, but frozen solid in winter. Others offered great hunting in fall, but turned into mosquito nightmares come spring. Many tribes developed what you might call a hub-and-spoke system. The longhouse served as home base, but families would spend months away at seasonal camps positioned along profitable trade routes. It was like having a main office, but doing most of your actual business on the road. The economics were simple but brutal. Stay put in your cozy longhouse and watch other tribes get rich trading furs. Or adapt, become mobile, and potentially prosper. Most chose prosperity over comfort. The weird part? This economic shift happened gradually. Families didn't just wake up one morning and decide to abandon centuries of tradition. They started with short trading expeditions, then longer ones, until eventually the longhouse felt more like a storage unit than a home. But even as trade pulled them away, something deeper kept calling them back. You know what's fascinating about Native Americans and their longhouses? They had the ultimate seasonal home setup long before anyone coined the term snowbird. These weren't permanent abandonments we've been talking about. They were strategic retreats with built-in return plans. Think about your favorite vacation spot. You leave, but you always come back, right? Well, Native American tribes operated on a similar principle, except their vacation homes were survival necessities. When spring arrived and resources replenished themselves, guess where everyone headed? Straight back to those sturdy longhouses they'd left behind months earlier. The Haudenosaunee, better known as the Iroquois, were masters of this comeback strategy. They'd abandon their longhouses during harsh winters or when local game ran thin, but come springtime, boom, they'd return like clockwork. These structures served as their home base, their cultural headquarters, their family reunion spot, all rolled into one. Here's the kicker. Some of these longhouses stood empty for months, even years, yet remained in surprisingly good condition. The construction was so solid that nature barely made a dent. Makes you wonder if modern builders could learn a thing or two about durability from these ancient architects. But here's where it gets really interesting. Archaeological evidence shows that some longhouses were rebuilt in the exact same spots, generation after generation. Same location, same orientation, same basic design. Talk about brand loyalty. These weren't just buildings. They were ancestral touchstones, spiritual anchors that connected families to their heritage. The cyclical nature of this lifestyle created fascinating patterns. Tribes would establish satellite camps during hunting seasons, temporary settlements near fertile fishing grounds, even winter shelters in protected valleys. Yet the longhouse remained the true north of their existence, the place they'd inevitably return to when conditions improved. Today, archaeologists can trace these patterns through soil layers and artifact distributions. They find evidence of repeated occupation, seasonal abandonment, and triumphant returns. It's like reading a story written in pottery shards and fire pits. Modern native communities still honor this concept of cyclical return. Many tribal gatherings happen at traditional longhouse sites, maintaining connections that span centuries. These aren't museum pieces, they're living reminders of adaptive wisdom. The Longhouse story isn't about permanent abandonment. It's about strategic flexibility, seasonal adaptation, and the enduring pull of home. Sometimes the smartest move is knowing when to leave and when to come back.